the story of Irish food is very much wrapped up with England and with the famine and colonization in that period. So it's very difficult on the one hand to say, well, what was going on in terms of the indigenous Irish. I mean, you did have a landed class here, and it was very much part and parcel of this kind of European aristocracy, and they did have pretty much whatever they wanted, sugar and that. So I mean, you can go back and look at the elements of cooking over fire and like pit cooking as well, which is like called Fulachfia, where they would literally dig a trough of water and then put stones into it and heat up the water and then cook a large piece of meat, like say wrapped lamb in hay. I put a lamb wrapped in hay. Like, and that type of cooking more, I suppose, for me, reminds me more of what I suppose the elements that we like out of like Patagonian cooking at the moment, and looking at that with cooking lamb and that. And so I would probably see Ireland coming from that tradition more in terms of like roasting whole salmon or cooking things whole, as opposed to little delicate dishes. But then, I mean, I suppose when you think about it in terms of the Asian side of things, if you're defining stuff, you probably end up defining Irishness in relation to different pies and stews and stuff that has probably come out of Ireland since the 16th or 17th century. And a lot of that was in the book as well. And it's very hard to pinpoint. I mean, you can trace where pies and stews come from, but it's very hard to tie them down. And in Ireland is very close to England and to Scotland and to Wales, and sometimes to separate them out doesn't make an awful lot of sense in terms of food culture. I know we have our own distinct individual identities, but when it comes to food, there was so much migration back and forward that we share a lot of similarities. And I think now we try and assert differences, whereas in the past, I think it was the similarities that were asserted.
And would you say that because as you're talking about that, I'm just kind of thinking, you're right, yeah, and is there, let's say, compared to contemporary or traditional European cuisines like French and Italian, they're considered quite complex, whereas people look at, I guess, other regional foods within Europe and consider them somewhat simpler. What do you think of that?
I think all European countries have a peasant tradition, or whatever they want to call it, an indigenous tradition. And I don't think the French or the Spanish one, and I'm more up to date with the Spanish, I suppose, peasant cooking. I mean, I don't see that much difference between that and the Irish cooking in the last couple of hundred years in terms of the dishes that were produced out of necessity. I think that when we look to France and the complexities of I suppose the French system, we're really talking about like 200 years, and we're talking about like the French like codifying a certain system, and also probably appropriating a lot of stuff from other countries and putting it into their own book. And I think that we have to be careful in that regard, because if we look at food in that way, it seems that France, so that is on top, and then you have a scaling order down to regions that just have a poor, peasant tradition. Whereas I think there's a great complexity, a historical complexity in a lot of peasant food, and I think it's very interesting to find out where these dishes began and was there variations of them. And for me, there's also a bit of fun in that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think there's a lot of kind of weight put on French cooking. I think partially because of exactly what you mentioned, which is they codified it. So that really kind of set, I guess, the template that a lot of other cuisines or a lot of chefs have kind of worked according to. And I do think there were probably a lot of techniques, regional techniques, which got drawn into that, but because they were codified by the French, they've gone down as French techniques.
Yeah, that's very much so. And even in terms of, I think the 19th century is key in terms of that. And I think that the powers that be in the 19th century, whether it was England or France or Germany, came out with a better, whether or not they adopted or they pulled in stuff from other countries. It was really that codification that when that went over to the States, it was that kind of French model that led everything.